a friend of mine asked me. I listed some answer to her, but I thought that it was very interesting, the question, and it was about the archetypes from Carl Jung.
Mm-hmm.
He has his explanations for that, but they are patterns of behaviors for a mother, father, one of the aspects of it. And I understand that it's he says that it's on universal archaic patterns, images derived from the collective unconscious. That's short definition, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But the question was about how MyBigTOE sees that, because it could be easily interpreted as being a kind of programmation of programmed patterns of being that are available there for you when you arrive for this experience here, let's say this package of experience, to use those patterns to help you, guide you around until you learn more. And you are a mother, you are going to be mother for the first time in your life. You have some instincts there that you access from these models, and it seems it would easily be something kind of programmed. Okay, so what would be your view or MyBigTOE view of what are these archetypes?
Okay. Matter of fact, the MyBigTOE model explains those very well. And they are a result of what's called collective consciousness. And sometimes you hear that called as a group consciousness. And what a group consciousness is, it's a vector sum of all of the consciousnesses that belong to the group. Okay, now let's start out with something simple, like a mob. A mob is a group. A mob is a bunch of angry people, a bunch of very angry people, and that mob has its own collective consciousness. If you join that mob, then you will become angrier than you were before you joined that mob.
Mm-hmm.
It's this collective consciousness, and that mob will do more terrible things than any one of the members of that mob would do on their own. But together, they can, they're much more brutal than they would be individually. And that's because that angry mindset that they have affects each other. Each person's anger helps other people feel angry as well. That's a collective consciousness that would belong to that group if you feel like you're a part of that group. Now, the way you either are or are not a member of that group is just by your own intent. Do you see yourself as a part of that group? If you don't, then that collective consciousness is not going to bother you. It's just going to bother those people who identify themselves as a member of that group. Now, this works on all levels at all sorts of groupings. So if we have a grouping, say, as big as humanity, okay, well, humanity has its own collective consciousness, where it's kind of the sum of all the humans, and it contains information of what it is like to be human, of what it means to be human as we are human. Not some fundamental concept of human, but it's the vector sum of all the people that are in the group. So that's of all the humans. So you might think a human collective consciousness would have to be very broad. It wouldn't be too specific. It would be a very broad sort of thing. But there are human archetypes, as well as male-like archetypes and female archetypes, and like you said, mother and father archetypes. But you also can have national archetypes, a country, from all the people who in their mind associate themselves with that country. Then that country has a collective consciousness. And somebody from the outside comes in and says, well, okay, I want to be a part of this country now. Well, now in their mind, they've associated with it, and they start getting information from that collective consciousness, which means they start acting a little more like the people in that country. They think a little more like it. They start to become like that. And even a corporation, if you have a corporation like Mercedes-Benz or IBM.
Caterpillar.
Caterpillar, yeah. All the people, or Amazon even, all the people that are a member of that, so everybody that works for IBM, they all have a collective consciousness as well. And when you go into work for IBM, you'll notice that your attitudes and your feelings and your values start to change a little bit. You start to become more like the people from IBM. And all the people in IBM kind of dress alike. They kind of have, you know, similar ideas about life and reality and that sort of thing. So you can be a, you know, you can be a family. You can be as small a group as, you know, just a family. That family, if you have a close family where the people really identify as I'm a member of this family, then there's archetypes of that family that people can connect to. Now, let's say that you work for IBM, but you don't really feel like you're a part of it. You feel like you're an outsider. Well, you may work there, but if you don't join the group, if you don't see yourself as an IBM guy, then the collective consciousness won't affect you very much. Mm-hmm. You won't get much feedback from it. It will be a very light touch. So you may be a citizen of Brazil, and if you really have an identity, I'm a Brazilian, then you'll get more of that collective Brazilian archetype, and it'll mean more to you. You'll give more to it, and you'll get more back from it than if you just live there, but don't really identify very strongly, you know, with the country. So that's collective consciousness. And that's really what Carl Jung was talking about in his archetypes. He didn't understand that it was just it's a function of consciousness, but he did understand that there are these archetypes, mm-hmm. and that these archetypes actually come with content. And people who are members of a particular group get that content. You know, that content is connected to them, because when you say I'm a member of a group, you kind of open a link, if you will. You open a psychic or a mental link to that group, and now you change the group a little because you kind of share your stuff. But because you're only one and that group is big, then mostly the group affects you a whole lot more than you affect the group.
They carry more weight.
Yeah, they carry a lot more weight. So you end up being more like the group. So any organization, it could be a church organization, like I say, or a occupation, you know, all plumbers, you know, might, you know, if they really identify with I'm a plumber, then all plumbers would form a group, and there would be some archetype that would have to do with plumbing and being a plumber. And if you really identify with that, you start getting information about plumbing, and you become a little better plumber just because you associate in your mind with that group of people strongly. You'll start to, you know, get some of that information, and you'll just get that as like intuition. It'll just be your intuition. Well, I should use this kind of valve instead of that kind of valve. You know, you'll get that intuition, and that's you know, tapping into that larger archetype of plumbers. So it's interesting. All the groups we're in, you know, we're a member of a family. You know, we may be a member of a church, or a member of a social club, a member of a country, you know, a member of a state. Who knows? You know, we got all kinds of things. You know, maybe we're a member of the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, or you know, some social organization. And it works the same way. As we become part of that social organization, we start acting more like the people in that social organization. Now, one of the nice things about this collective consciousness is we talked about the mob, where the mob pulls everybody down to a lower level of behavior, a lower level of evolution, just because everybody gets more angry. Well, the same thing happens with people who are very evolved. If you have somebody who has very little fear, and they're full of love and caring and cooperation and compassion, and you hang out with that person, well, it just pulls you up a little bit. And if you identify with groups that are like that, and you interact with them, and you identify, it pulls you up a little bit. So you find it easier to get rid of your fear, and easier to not get upset or not get angry, because now you're hanging out with a group that is a higher quality group than you are. So who you hang out with is really kind of important, because if you identify yourself as part of that group, you start becoming more like it. You start getting downloads from that collective consciousness. You have inclinations to kind of see things the way they see it. So that's why we tell our children it's very important who your friends are. Make sure, you know, that you pick some really good quality people for friends, because that will affect your life. If you pick some very low quality people for friends, that will affect your life too, but not in a very good way.
Yeah.
So that is really what Carl Jung was talking about, was this collective consciousness. And it's an interesting thing because we belong to so many groups and we don't realize that they affect us. They give us insights sometimes, but sometimes they may give us beliefs, or sometimes they may give us fears, or they may give us more anger. You know, they can give us all sorts of things, but they also can give us good things. So that's what that's about.
So you have just assessed two different aspects. There is a good aspect and a bad aspect. And
Yes.
Your free will is very important here, because if you decide, let's say, with a bad group that generate bad things, and you get into it and identify with that, and you start to get input from it and accept it, because you have to accept, I imagine. I mean, okay, if you decide to delegate and do everything that you receive and think of it as yours, but it's still your decision.
Yes.
The consequences will be for you.
Exactly.
And you are not
choice.
obliged. You had not the obligation to follow that.
Exactly.
Guidance.
No, nothing forces you to join, and nothing forces you to do anything. You have to make that choice.
Yeah.
But it does influence you.
Yeah.
It influences the choices you make, but only you can make the choice. There are no excuses. You can't blame any of your choices on anybody else. All of your choices are choices that you make, and you have to take responsibility for your choices and for the consequences of those choices.
And let's say this sum of the vector of everyone in that group that generates this whole thing that you may be in or not, this or that. I mean, it's not something alone by itself with free will. Okay, it's just being pulled together by all the people being together and thinking the same and modulating, let's say, in the same vibration or something like that.
Yeah.
But
that's right.
Exist alone as a being. I mean,
no.
With individual free will. Okay.
No, it doesn't exist alone, and for that matter, it changes as we change. Let's say you talked about mothers. Well, being a mother today in 2019 is a lot different than being a mother 20,000 years ago. And it changes. So that collective consciousness around motherhood, everybody who identifies as a mother, that changes. It keeps updating itself. So that's what keeps it current. That's why it doesn't like grow old and doesn't work anymore, because it's always current. It always is, stuff that you can use. If it was something that just was all by itself, like you were saying, if it was just a thing in itself, well, eventually it wouldn't make any sense anymore, because motherhood 10,000 years ago was different. Responsibilities were different. Mothers then had two big interests, and that is staying alive, and finding something to eat, for them and their children. And that consumed almost all of their energy, just those things, getting out of the elements. And that's not true today. Mothers today generally aren't in that same environment that they were then. So the fears are a little different. The attitudes are different toward it. So things change. But now with motherhood, that's a special one, because motherhood has another component too, and that's instincts. You see, there's a difference between collective consciousness and instincts. Animals have instincts, and humans are an animal. So humans have instincts as well. And instincts in humans and in every other animal tend to center around survival. They center around and a survival of the species, not just individual survival, but species survival. So it's survival and procreation. So it's about, getting enough to eat. It's about, making more babies so the race doesn't, become extinct. It's about, shelter and relationships. So we have instincts that on the on those things, attached to those things that have to do with our survival and our procreation. So the motherhood is part of the procreation part. It's also part of the survival part. We as a race won't survive without, at least enough procreation of new beings as those that die. Anyway, so some of that is just instinctual. And instincts also can change and can update. Instincts are a product of the environment. Now, instincts are very slow to change. We still have instincts that are, 100,000 years old. And some of our basic instincts haven't changed for, 100,000 years. But you can modify those instincts with your intent. So you don't have to do the things that your instincts say to do. You can modify them a little bit, make them, update them a little bit and do things differently, but you're still doing the basic instinct, which is surviving and procreating. So those instincts are very fundamental and very, very basic. And motherhood is one of those things. So females have instincts. We talk about a female who's getting in her middle 20s and we say her clock goes off, which means she starts feeling like she wants to start having babies. She wants to start a family. She wants to, find a husband and get a good situation and start raising children. Well, that's part of her instincts to procreate. It just, she gets to that point where her biology starts telling her that she needs to do that. And the thing with instincts is that if you are crossways with your instinct, if you're doing the opposite that your instinct wants you to do, it makes you, what can we say, feel bad. It makes you feel like you're missing something. You're not doing it right. You feel failed in some way. You don't feel satisfied, though, with your life. So if we're crosswise with our instincts, and those are, like I say, they're around survival and around sex. If we don't stay in line with those instincts, it'll drive us nuts. It'll make us grouchy, we'll get neurotic. So it's important to know that you have instincts, what those instincts are. Now you can play those instincts out in many ways, but if you get, what I say, crossways to them, that means you get, going in the opposite direction of what the instinct is telling you to do. That will cause you depression. That will cause you, to get neurotic, because you're going against what your core being in your body says that you ought to be doing. And that creates stress, and stress creates a lot of other problems. So we need to understand our instincts. We need to satisfy those instincts, but in a way that makes sense today. See, so that's a different thing really than the collective consciousness. That's just biology. That's kind of the hardwiring. Some of our biology is hardwired like that. That's what allowed us to survive as a species.
By hardwired, you can say that it's a more strict programmation or code,
yes.
Let's say.
Yeah, it's code. It's programmed. Yeah.
Let's say in an equivalent way to say it. Okay.
Yes.
But anyway, this you were talking about this is also another way to, let's say, create and perceive our realities, because if you get involved with some kind of movement that is very depressive, very negative, you'll be around with many people that act like that goes into that, and then you start seeing things, you start hearing things, and then everything confirms that the things are the way you expect, and then you are in the same world over the same surface, let's say, okay, and then you are seeing something completely different from many other people because you are fine-tuned to that channel, let's say.
Yes.
You are creating a reality, and you will be getting confirmation that everything is like that, and then it's not kind of madness too. If you are not aware and present and paying attention to the things, you get involved in it and let your control slip on that direction. Who knows where you end up? Okay.
Yes, absolutely, that works, and we see a lot of that these days. The internet is full of very scary things. There's a lot of I guess one of them would be the conspiracy theories, that are all full of fear, and it's
right
fear.
on target.
Yeah, fear, fear, fear in these conspiracy theories. And people who are fearful then latch onto those, because the thing is that once you see yourself as a victim,
Yes.
then you really go straight to the bottom. When you see yourself as a victim, you're lost, because victims can't do anything about it. You see, and what people do is they say, well, it's not my fault.
Yeah.
It's this other thing. It's the aliens. It's the, you know, the wealthy people. It's all, you know, they point their fingers at all kinds of other things
The
in a way.
mad God that created this.
Yeah, right. It's the angry God that created this mess, right? So what they're doing is they're trying to say, it's not my fault. Don't blame it on me. So they're trying to escape any responsibility for it. And then they end up as victims. And as a victim, you can't change anything. As a victim, you're stuck. You'll never, you know, you don't outgrow it. You don't see through it. Once you're a victim, you are lost down at the bottom. So that is the absolute worst place for any consciousness to be, is seeing itself as a victim. That's a trap that is hard to get out of, because you define it as a victim means you can't help it. If you can't do anything about it, well, then you're stuck with it. Now all you do is get angrier and angrier and angrier and more depressed, until you just kind of burn yourself out and you know, commit suicide, or just get mad and are a nasty person and that sort of thing. It's just that's kind of the worst thing can happen to anybody. And these conspiracy theories that are built on fear, they suck people into that. You know, people who are looking for an excuse and somebody to blame things on because they don't want to take responsibility for their own life and their own choices, they latch onto those things.
And
Then they, like you say, they get sucked in, and they're part of that collective consciousness. And you know, our reality, each one of us lives in our own reality, because our reality is what we interpret the information that we get. How we interpret that. We get information from the server, if you will, from the computer, from consciousness, and now we have to interpret that information. And your interpretation of that information is your reality. And we interpret things based on our beliefs, our fears, you know, our love, our caring, all that is that makes us up. That's how we interpret it. You know, I've heard a story, I don't know whether it's true or not, about a man in New York City who was terrified of elephants, wild elephants. Well, of course, there's no wild elephants in a big city. New York City, sort of like Sao Paulo. You know, it's just a big urban city. There's no elephants walking around. But because he believed it, if he'd see a puddle someplace, he'd say, ah, you see, that's an elephant's footprint. That's why that puddle's there. And if he'd see the wind blowing bushes around off on, you know, a distance away, he'd say, see, there's elephants behind there shaking those bushes. So he saw signs of elephants everywhere. And that's why he was so terrified of these elephants. So yes, just as you say, you create a reality that is your fear. So whatever your fears are, you will tend to create that reality that you fear. And that's unfortunate. So if you fear that, you know, this is an ugly place and everybody's out to get everybody else, you will tend to do things and say things and feel ways to create that place being that ugly. So if you have a very negative attitude about your life and about where you live, you will be helping your life and where you live to become more and more negative. So you become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So that's why the conspiracy theories that are based on fear, then they become part of the problem, not part of the solution, because that fear is actually helps create that reality that they fear.